Okay, sorry for that delay. It is also about systems, hardware and software. So it is a pleasure to present this summary report. The actual report is bigger, and I believe you have had a chance to go through it because it is available for download. And it is entitled The Clash of Systems, African Perceptions of the European Union and China Engagement. And these are fresh findings. What we are presenting here are fresh findings from our primary data survey. So on June 21st this year, this report made headlines in Germany, in the Berliner Zeitung, that is like the Berliner Daily, a leading daily newspaper in Germany. And of course it was in Germany. And for those of you who understand or speak German, you can see the headline was there, Studie EU-Einfluss in Afrika schwindet rapide. China steigt auf. That means EU's influence in Africa is degrading rapidly, but China is dominating, is rising. So let's see if the title did justice to our findings. So I'll take you through the background to this survey. We look at paradigms and legacy. Under methodology, data collection and analysis. And the results, the key findings and points of reflection, especially for African decision makers. Then conclusions we draw on the findings, the lessons from this research and policy recommendations. So we are talking about a clash of systems. We know a system is not a toolbox. A system is not a collection of disconnected items, but rather a system speaks to the integrity of system components, those components, and they work together as a united whole. So what is it a clash of? In summary, this report will introduce you to a clash of cultures. The low context culture of Europe, linear logic, versus the spiral logic that is typical of Asian communication style, China in this case. We'll also see a clash of complexes. We have superiority complex, issues of equality, colonial legacy, generational gaps, and peer perspectives on civilization. But you'll also see a clash of constructs, including philosophical constructs, paradigmatic constructs. And at the end of the report, we also made a strong statement that in China, we can say it's easier done than said, but for Europe, it is easier said than done. That is a clash of constructs and paradigmatic assumptions for excellence. So you can see the front page of that Berliner Zeitung, how the report was released in the Daily, Berliner Daily in Germany on June 21st. And in what is probably the largest survey of its kind, more than 1,000 African decision makers were asked about Europe's and China's influence. The findings are disturbing. Translated into English, that is what the German writing means. And you can see China at the center, and we have two prominent Africans. So in this report, we are saying that the centuries-old European values and systems model exported to Africa has found itself in an unfamiliar territory, and that is because of China. We'll see the clash of hardware approach and software approach, and which one is winning the race in Africa. So the background, we have changing times, realignments, emerging trends, COVID-19, which have only introduced a compelling urgency to re-examine Africa's partnerships with other regional blocs in terms of investment, trade, and development cooperation. And all these came in hand to give this report a compelling urgency. So when you are carrying out this survey, the 8 regional blocks in Africa, and the African diaspora distributed across 12 countries outside Africa, we designed the questions, more than 90 questions, to address these key issues. Not only the classical issues, but also the emerging trends and the mega trends. So the overall study objective was to assess the state of Africa's partnership with the European Union and China in terms of investment, trade, and development cooperation. So, because in the House we have academics, we have researchers, we have thought leaders, the result cannot be as good as the methodology you inject into it and the quality of the data. So we gave a keen attention to the methodology that would help us to come up with a rather objective assessment of the status quo and also projecting into the future what the findings imply for African decision makers and how Africa, by enjoying multiple suitors in this framework, can position itself to have competitiveness and real bargaining power. So the purposive sampling framework targeted 1645 respondents from 25 countries and African diaspora from 12 countries outside Africa. We used key informants and primary actors. The survey covered the period of October to December last year. You can see the distribution of respondents from academia all the way to government agencies. We also had a stakeholder workshop on March the 9th this year, which helped us to share some theses and stylized facts which we have to interrogate and debunk as per the existing situation and also the findings. So it was online survey, 92 questions. We used Survey Planet platform, which is similar to the other online survey platforms you can use, such as SurveyMonkey. But we have to questions from 1 very disagreeable to 7 very agreeable. So this is where the mathematical modeling comes in, where you gain the perceptions on an ordinal scale from 1 to 7, with 4 being the neutral, or the transition points of indifference. So the perception modeling was used to arrive at aggregates of positive responses and also negative responses. And why do we have to do this? Because when you just have an average index, it is more of a black box. We don't know what is in this box. So we try to have a clear divide and see how many people were saying yes, the agreeable part, and how many were on the other side, the dissenting part. And that clear divide helps to improve what we call in modeling black box to be gray box. But of course, the ultimate objective is to see what is inside what we call white box. So you can see the purposive sampling frame. You can see how we distributed the respondents, the member states key informants sample, primary actor sample, and that is what gave us a total of 1645. That was the targeted one, but we ended up getting 62% of this as the response rate. So for those who may want to see more of what was happening in the mathematical modeling part, I know most of you are very familiar with this because all have gone through higher education, and it's just a simple mathematical model where that A is now the overall index. So you will see in the infographics where we are giving you a mean score for China and a mean score for the European Union. That is the A, the aggregate index. But we also give you the divide, the positives and the negatives, so that you can see, even as we arrive at this average value, what is the divide of opinions to the questions, in terms of the questions that were asked. So coming to the results, we were able to extract 22 theses from the sticky points, and they tended to debunk narratives, all the stylized, what we call stylized facts. So it's about the clash of systems. It is also about the paternalistic approach of the EU to Africa. And we see this in our social and cultural systems because teenagers would want to identify more with their peers and they regard their parents as outdated. So this kind of rebellion is also evident in Africa, where Europe is trying to lecture Africa like a parent. But when we talk of China, it is giving more of the approach of a peer-to-peer sharing of ideas. And if we try to compare that to what we see in our society, then you can understand why Africa will be more receptive of the Chinese approach. Then, number 3, the backseat of basking in former glory. Europe would still be banking in former glory, but time has changed. Things are not as they were, but they are as they are now. And there's a need to change strategy. And I gave one example in March this year that I would like to repeat. That even in Kenya, in the academia, there are some universities that are still banking in former glory, but things have changed. So it is no longer just about speaking about the University of Nairobi as it were, but we want to know what is happening because younger universities are catching up and even overtaking them. From China's limited trade footprint in Africa to the pervasive foray within 2 decades. Look at the map. In the year 2000, the beginning of the millennium, China, where you see pink, that was China in terms of trade. So China only had a few spots in Africa where the products from China were being imported. But look, in barely 2 decades, what has happened? China has painted almost the whole of Africa in its color. That is in less than 2 decades. But we talk of the centuries-old European footprint in Africa. So you can see China has been working overtime. The EU's values and soft power exchanges, we are saying it is like breaking more from the less crucial area. So if you are fighting, there could be someone who is throwing so many jabs, but not hitting the right places. But then the opponent just targets near the heart. And one blow, you know what it will do. That is the strategy China is trying to employ. When it is investing in Africa, it is investing more in the fewer areas, but that Africans appreciate more. What we can see, the tangibles, the big infrastructure projects which are completed ahead of time, as opposed to the soft and abstract values such as democracy, freedom, the rule of law, which Europe is emphasizing. So there's a need for a change of strategy. China is ahead of the EU in quick decisions, timely completion of infrastructure projects, and what we value also in Africa, non-interference in internal affairs of African states. And another point that would easily escape us because of basking in the backseat of former glory is scholarships. If you look at the entire European Union, you readily say that the European Union has done more in terms of giving scholarships to Africans, but that is not the case. China has given more scholarships to Africans than the entire European Union combined. China, just one block, and the data is there, which we verified. And that table is also showing that if you look at the EU, where the EU is leading, this is now the divide of the positives. So when you talk of open negotiations, China scored 56% of the responses that were positive, which is that China is engaging open negotiations in Africa. and the EU 66.9%. You can see the range is not too far. But again, if you look at the EU column, it is paying more. Where you see the things, it means it is leading. But China is still scoring where it matters. That is why we're using this figurative analogy, that your opponent is throwing more jumps at you, but they are hitting the areas that don't matter much. But you are more tactful, and you just need one blow where it matters most. So the few areas where China is scoring, such as quick decisions, quick project completion, non-interference in internal affairs, and use of corrupt tendencies, just exploiting corrupt ways, are making it gain advantage over the European Union and Africa. So in terms of the infographics, as we move towards the conclusion, when it comes to net-Trump diplomacy, both are culpable. There is no better priest here. The EU cannot lecture China in terms of net-Trump diplomacy, because from those findings you see both are almost at par. If you are to give a grade to this student, net-Trump 58.99%, maybe we can round off to 59%. It is almost a weak B, and even 66.4 is a B. Go to debt relief, 70.5, that is now an A by university standards, and 61.5 is a B. So you can see the difference is not that far. And go to the mean values. Now the A you saw in the mathematical model. You see Europe mean of 4.6 against China 4.9. So China is ahead there when it comes to the aggregate index on terms of net-Trump diplomacy. But debt relief, again, you see the mean values 4.9 and 4.6. What we are saying is that if you look at the mean values of these infographics, they are neck to neck. The difference does not go beyond one level. So if you are talking about the integer scale we were using, you will hardly see a place where, if you round off, they are more than 2 levels apart. And that is why the neck-to-neck race is already qualifying China as a formidable challenger to the European Union in Africa. In terms of non-interference from the infographics, you can see China scoring better, both in terms of the positive responses and the aggregate, the A value, the mean index. Come to exploiting corruption, the European Union at 33%, China at 55%, China quite ahead there, and you can also see the same in the mean values, 4.5 against 3.5 for the European Union. Big physical infrastructure, now China is far ahead of the EU, and Africans also appreciate these infrastructure projects that are tangible, and we interact with them, we need the services of these infrastructure assets on a daily basis. Surveillance capitalism and marine power, when we talk about digital surveillance and data security, again, Africa is a big team of both the EU and China, and both China and the EU are culpable. Both are engaging multiple surveillance capitalism, digital surveillance, and exploiting data. So matters of data security and marine power influence on Africa, you can see how the two compare. So what are the reflections? The report raises curious policy questions for the three actors, namely, with the ongoing competing interests of the European Union, or those of China, be at the expense of Africa. Is a strategic competition feasible to enable the three actors to benefit from the competition? The three actors here, Africa, China, and the EU. What type of diplomatic recalibration is needed in the unfolding new order in Africa? And what is the role of African agency in the unfolding clash of systems? All those are important policy questions and points of reflection. In conclusion, we can say both the EU and China deploy direct diplomacy in Africa. Both are at par in reaching Africa's data security through digital surveillance. China has displaced the EU in soft power influence through educational scholarships to Africa. The neck-to-neck mean scores of China and the EU on more than 80% of the questions, never going beyond a difference of one level when rounded off to an integer scale. 5 against 4 equals 4 against 3 raise a compelling perception that China will easily close the gap and overtake the EU on most of the aspects of partnership with Africa. And this also reinforces what we read in the Berliner Zeitung, the Berlin newspaper, that it is true that the findings are disturbing the European Union. Policy recommendation: the EU should set up its paternalistic approach and embrace a strategic partnership posture towards Africa. The EU should recalibrate foreign policy and diplomatic approach towards Africa, and they examine why the EU is slower and outpaced by China in Africa. The EU to promote the development of indigenous African private sector, and the EU and we need to develop EU-Africa digital surveillance security cooperation in a transparent big data mining framework. Those are the key policy recommendations that came out of this report. And now it is my pleasure to hand it over again to James to guide us in the discussion part. Thank you for the engagement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nation Adero. I'm sure that's good data for us to reflect on. There's a caveat. Remember, the Frederick Naumann Foundation is an EU foundation, and they commissioned IREN to do this survey. And you notice the policy recommendations are recommendations for EU. So we've not done any recommendations for China. In our press statement, when we read it out, we have a spot for Africa. Why? Because we know Kenya is in Africa, and those who know a good job in politics. We are in Africa, and Africa is our business. So in our release, we shall be capturing also policy recommendations from Africa. And now we go to the discussion part, which will take a few minutes. We'll start with Mr. Ali Khan Sachu, who is going to, he's read through the report, and as I said earlier, Ali Khan is very active on social media, discussing matters of geopolitics. So he's going to give his view of the report, and thereafter we'll invite Professor Macharia Munene also to give his views, and then we'll launch the report, and then we come to the conclusion of the event. So let's have Ali Khan Sachu's viewpoints. Are they ready? You know, in the world of technology nowadays, we can have people contributing from different spaces. They don't have to be physically present. So I hope for the members of the press, you're also preparing your questions. Once we will be reading out our press statement after the discussion, you feel free to ask questions and give way in comments. I'm introducing my colleagues already. We met Dr. Nation Adero. There's also Josephat Juma, seated right at the back over there, and myself will be available to respond. And also there's Kepta Ombati from the Frederick Naumann Foundation, and it's the foundation that made it possible for this survey to be done. Are we ready? Earlier. And also tweet a little bit and tag me so I can also retweet. Yeah, I'm told Twitter now is no longer for young people, right? So we need also to, it's quite interesting how technology moves. There's a time when you were on Yahoo, you were the most current, right? Nowadays, if you get an email, Yahoo, it tells you this must I have a person, right? I think we migrated to Gmail. This is the most common, right? So are we ready for Ali? On tweeting? Yeah, we have the hashtag Clash of Systems. Will you just write it there? Clash of Systems. Clash of Systems, yes, please. And that's what we've been treating with Ali searching this Clash of Systems because it's, as you said, Kepler, to catalyze the intellectual input from Africa, really. We'd like to have more books coming out of this very powerful title, Clash of Systems, because we know you can evaluate the systems from different perspectives: politics, culture, foods, economy, development, science, all that. Okay, now let's welcome Ali Kansachu, the founder, CEO, investment advisory firm, Rich Management, to make his comments. Go ahead.
My name is Ali Kansachu, geoeconomic and geopolitical analyst. And I'd first like to thank James Shikwati and his team for this invitation to speak to you for a few minutes about the report that's been presented. I would like to commend James and the team for this report. I have not come across scholarship of this type looking at this situation with the level of granularity and a continent-wide analysis. It produced a very interesting report. I think, if you read the media, you would not necessarily appreciate the nuance that James and his team have brought to this subject. I'm speaking to you from Lamu, which is interesting of itself because although James and his team have looked at the Chinese engagement with Africa over the last 2 decades, as we know, DNA was found here in Pate Island, for example, which belonged to Chinese sailors from the time of the visit of Admiral Zheng He, who subsequently became a very iconic figure for the whole China-Africa story. At this moment in time, what I find interesting from a geopolitical point of view, firstly, with respect to Kenya, we're very currently inward-looking. We have an incoming election. The focus is purely on that. In terms of the Europeans as well, it's quite an inward-looking moment. The situation in Ukraine is seen as an existential situation by the Europeans, and therefore they too, I think, are looking at things from a very inward perspective. And therefore the report and its timing is very apt, I think, for both Kenya and Europe, and China as well. What observations can I make is that, firstly, with respect to Europe, we have huge macro developments happening. For example, we know from now to 2050, 1 in 2 of every newborn in the world will be in Africa. We know that both the European and Chinese demographics are moving older, and essentially the human capital that will power both these economies in many respects are going to be African. And therefore the nature of the engagement between those continents and ourselves is going to be a key factor to the way all 3 continents develop going forward. We can easily criticize both the Europeans and the Chinese for the engagement, and there is a lot of propaganda, which I think this report really cuts through in many regards. But, we've got to look at Africa. I think the Europeans have got to look at Africa as an economic opportunity, and, that dreaded phrase, win-win, is one that can be applied the way I think Europe now has to look at the African continent. and less through a security immigration prism, which seems to be the main prism quite often that the European continent looks at Africa through. There are plenty of challenges, but I think this is a wake-up call to European policymakers who have, I have to admit, put forward, interesting roadmaps, but I don't think have looked at the main challenge, which is how to uplift the average living standard at a time of a cost of living crisis globally for the average African. I think if we look through, if the European policymakers look at the continent in that way, we'll see a very, very different and more profitable and more worthwhile engagement. With respect to what I learned from this analysis of China, it's clearly there is a great difference between the way Chinese engagement is reported in the Western media. Debt trap diplomacy, there is a lot of negative reporting. And it's interesting, the divergence between the way it's being reported in the press and the perception of the average African as represented in this report that you have put out. And I think all Europeans, Chinese, Africans have to consider that the more engagement and more non-partisan reporting is going to drive better decisions. And we often talk about African agency, and my final point is this. If we really believe in African agency, I think what we've got to be doing more of is negotiating with these two juggernauts more as a continent and less on an individualistic basis. And I think that's my key takeaway. These relationships are too important, the outcomes too important for the future of the continent. And therefore we have to combine, create more leverage, and not be concerned about either or. It's both, and it's about getting the best deal that we can for the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali Khan. I know he's following on Twitter. This juncture, I'd like to invite Professor Macharia Munene to make his comments, then we'll be launching the report. Yes. Even remove the laptop.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Start with, let me thank Irene and James and Rachel Newman Foundation. I heard this morning they are called FNF. And Stefan, who is not here. Now, the FNF mission says clearly that they are in the business of promoting democratic ideals, which itself is also ideal. Equally ideal is James and Irene's commitment to cutting-edge research on political economies and their ramifications at the global and domestic levels. So these two seemingly idealistic agendas converge. And they converge in that the FNF supports the research. different types of research. And the latest of these is the one that's been launched together. The clash of systems. And what is it that's being clashed? And it boils down to expectations, culture, beliefs, attitudes towards each other, some very negative attitudes. And they are captured in the report in one way or another. So the importance of this report is the stress on perceptions, how different peoples in the 3 global regions, China, Europe, Africa, tend to see each other. That presumed perception for each other affects both decision making at the policy level. The policymakers in Europe, in China, and in Africa, the perception affects them. And second, it also affects public reactions. Sometimes the way policy makers see things is not the same way that their people see them. And they are sometimes forced to adjust. Once people start making a lot of noise, most of the time policy makers ignore the public until the public makes noise. So the perception of the public is important in decision making. So how the public perceives their region as it relates to the other regions, or how Africans see their region as it relates to Europe and to China is important. Because the policymakers who would not want their public to get angry with them, then try to adjust to avoid trouble. And that's not just in common in Africa. Sometimes it is less so in Africa than in Europe and in the Americas. So how does Africa see China and Europe? The way it does affects African, Chinese, and EU decision makers. So what do we see? And I think Alice Sanchez alluded to it. The propaganda machine is great. And they tell us Africa is disappearing in the belly of the Chinese. So the Chinese progress or perceived progress is at the expense of the Europeans and let's say the West in general, the conservative West. That's what the problem is. The Chinese are making progress in Africa, supposedly at the expense of the European. This is knee-jerk reaction. So now they're walking up 20 years old. What are the Chinese doing there? They're supposed to be the one in charge. So what are the Chinese doing there? And that's a concern in the West. One time in Britain, in the House of Commons, there was an MP who was complaining, why are the Chinese building the big road instead of the British? You see, they say, what's wrong with these people? They had a chance to do it, they didn't, so why are they complaining? But it was knee-jerk reaction, which is then seemingly informed by an attitude. Because Europe in the West tend to suffer from superiority or racist complex. And we've seen this in recent times. One of the good examples is when you talk about refugees who gets pumped out. Africans get the hell out of here. The others, oh, you Christian, we are like us. So the Europeans are still suffering from racist and imperialist and superiority complex, which cannot match very well with some of the developments in Africa. On their part, of course, we are told that they are taking over Africa, but that's not just the case, because the Chinese strategy is not just Africa. In fact, Africa is a very small part of that strategy. That's all. So they are taking over Europe. Now, what is the Belt and Road Initiative? It starts from China and ends up where? In Europe. It starts in Europe and ends up in China. And wherever you go in the world, what do you find? The Chinese are the ones who are doing this or doing that. Is that an accident? Or very carefully orchestrated strategy? The part the Chinese are very good in PR, no doubt about that. And why are they good in PR? Because they did their studies, they did their analysis before they start going out. The Chinese used to have this mentality. The forbidden city mentality extending to the forbidden country mentality, and they have come out of that. Those of you who have been to China, you know that gate, the Tiananmen Square, getting to the forbidden city. It was not just physical, but the mentality had been a forbidden mentality. So they've come out of that. And coming out of that forbidden mentality, they've gone out of the way to get to the rest of the world, instead of waiting for the world to come and free the world. So when we are dealing with this, we just don't look at it as an African problem. It is an issue the Chinese have done very well to make it advantageous to themselves, looking after their own interests. So while China goes out of its way to appear to fit in the host environment, and therefore acceptable, the West in Europe still suffers colonial master attitude when dealing with Africans. So the West tends to treat Africans as if they are perpetual children. And the Africans resent that. And you've seen some of these things. Just because they represent some country, thinks they can lecture people on who to relate it to. People say, well, who are you? They don't like to be told that who are you in the first place. So the advantage the Chinese have is that they play down and then look at it there. I think that's what I was saying. They appear like peers. They appear as not superior people, inferior. We are just like you, man. We've been mistreated by the Europeans, like you. We are third world, like you. Suffer everything, like you. But what do the Europeans do? They don't treat Africans as equal. They're inferior. And because of that treatment of Africans as inferior, they end up presenting and finding the Chinese more accommodating. James, if you allow me, I think I can tell a small story. We were in China together at one time.
Yes, you allow you. It's okay. We go to the launch.
Yes. And then we asked the Chinese, how do you do it? And the answer they gave us was very telling. The attitude. So whoever comes in charge of a major project is a prominent member of the Chinese Communist Party. And he's given instructions, don't you go there and embarrass the party. So they live on the site. If anything goes wrong, they are the first to catch it and fix it. Their counterparts don't live. They live in Europe or some other place, and they come back once every 2 months, first class flight. They live in Windsor or some other high class hotel. Then they go see animals at Mara, and they go back, and that's all part of the cost. So cost reduction. Then of course the attitude, how you deal with the cost. And most important, they deliver on time. So when you want something done, what do you do? The one who delivers at a reasonable cost, not the one who overcharges you and does not deliver. So we come now to questions. Start from the identifying with the host. Is the Chinese claim the takeover claim? Is it a reality or is it a myth? Yes, they are there, but have they taken over? It's pointed out that Africa owes more debt to Europe than to China. Yet the narrative is that Africa is enslaved to China rather than to Europe. Question: is this a scare strategy to stop Africa from liberating itself from European clutches? Is it? I think the Taliban made a point. China tends to invest more intangible. You can see it. The West likes to invest in the abstract, visible, while they still having strong control. So, to whom is China a threat? Is it a threat to Europe or to Africa? And that answer to that question will then lead to some answers. So does the European Union need to adjust its approach to Africa? And I think there was a suggestion to that effect. If it is to get along, stop that high-handedness, racist approach to Africa. Stop it. Then how does China respond to the emerging EU challenge to its presence in Africa? Because it has to respond. And Africa. How would Africa, the African policymakers, respond to both the EU and China? Balancing the two, bearing in mind all the time, paramount concern, the interest of Africa and the right of African policymakers to make their own decisions without having to be told by anyone as to what that policy should be. So the report is very good by raising some of these concerns. if Europe wants to, then it's the media that it is losing to it, according to this perception. How does it react to it? And how do African policymakers take this report and make use of it to the advantage of the African countries? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. So I think we're going right according to the program. Now we've had the two discussions that at least had the ability to access our report earlier. I don't know if there's any question from the non-media members before we launch the report. Because I know we have also members from the university community present. Because once we launch, then the media will be the people hogging the space for questions and comments. Well, yes, Captain. Maybe just naomba basi uje hapa kwa Kiswahili cha Kenya utoe maoni kabla tuja what is launching in Swahili? Kuzindua. Kabla tujazindua hii ripoti ya muhimu sana kuhusu the clash of systems.
Asante sana bwana mwenyekiti, na asante sana kwa mawiji wote wenye wametuongoza kwa ufasaha na ustadi wa hali ya juu katika mada ya leo. Tunashukuru na tunawapongeza. Nina swali moja tu kwa mawiji. Katika chapisho letu
in English.
In this publication, in this research report, we've presented the EU-China engagement with Africa as a competition. And in the analysis and critique, we've deepened that, which suggests as a zero-sum game. The question is it possible to also perceive this as complementary rather than competitive zero-sum relationship? In other words, can Africa tap from both ends? Can Africa take what is good from China and reject what is bad, and take from EU what is good and reject what is bad? So complement. Thanks very much.
Professor.
The answer is yes.
Please, Prof.
Okay.
Please, do you have another question as well, so that once we finish, then we just launch the report? You have something? Okay.
The answer to your question is yes. In fact, towards the end, I pointed out Africa's interest. Our policy makers must be aware, if they do not know, then they should be made to know what the African interests are. And with that, we need to balance and take what is good in EU, West, and there are some good things there. And take what is good from China, and there's some good things. And leave out, be able to tell the bad things and just say, you are partner, you are partner. But the ultimate decision should be Africans, policymakers. To know that, they have to know that's part of the reason the report is good. Talking about the perception. And then shape the decision to suit African interests, rather than European or Chinese interests, but African interests. interest. And that way they'll be complementary, because there'll be convergence of interests. The European interests converge with African interests. Look at that deal. We talk. When African interests and the Chinese interests converge, go ahead. Because the ultimate concern is very good for Africa. And we entrust our leaders, legitimate leaders, to make those decisions. Unfortunately, sometimes some of our leaders do not seem to know what they're doing. That's the problem. So that's why they need some education. Yeah? National interest, continental interest. They don't give out core interest in favor of 1 or 2 million Jews. I think that would be, yes, it can be done, and it should be done.
Okay.
Yes, Prof. As you know, you're my senior in international relations. Yes, my name is George Mangi. I teach diplomacy at the Eastern Area University. Prof, you're my senior in IR. Don't you think, from where I sit, because we teach about China, Africa a lot, don't you think why China is getting the leverage it is in Africa has more to do with exploiting the loophole of the principle of non-interference in Africa affairs? And you see, when you look at it objectively, that's more like it does not demand such values as accountability and all that, which the West is not ready to compromise. Don't you think that is the stronger point for the Chinese?
Prof, Mr. Mike.
On this point, that is a fallacy. Every country looks out for its interests. Okay? How it does it, it's its business. Now, when you talk about corruption, the West is as corrupt as anybody can be. Yeah? The West interferes with Kenyan affairs on a regular basis. It interferes with African affairs on a regular basis. Yes, so we are promoting this, or we like this. Their values, which is okay, because that is their interests. There's nothing wrong with that. Promoting their interests. But their interests are not necessarily African interests. The Chinese are also promoting their own what? As I pointed out, they do their analysis, their research. And the idea, what they want, is to penetrate the rest of the world and get what they need. If they are not going to get what they need by making a lot of noise, useless noise on some things, they are not going to engage in that. Because the key thing is that they want to move ahead. And they've succeeded in some parts. And that's why you have this knee-jerk reaction. Now, when you talk about non-interference, it's not a Chinese problem. After how we've seen the West also exercises that principle of non-interference, where its interests are concerned. Yeah? If it makes no sense to interfere in a country in terms of your interests, you don't. So this interference thing is a political, is a strategy to control the rest. So when it is not in your interest, you don't do it. Yes, so you've just seen a very good example. Joe Biden was in Saudi Arabia the other day. Did he just say anything about his family? It's not in his interest. So what's the difference there? You are places there. The primary thing is the interest of the country doing it. If it advances what you want, you do it. If it does not, you shut up. It's a common practice. So if the Chinese think that they will advance their interest by behaving certain ways, they'll do it. I once thought I was very intelligent. Once. And I went to France to tell them how corrupt they are. It was a conference. And I was giving examples of things. And then they looked at me and said, "You even don't know what you're talking about. Let us tell you how corrupt we are." And then they gave reasons for why they do that. National interests. How can they allow companies to go bankrupt? Which means a lot of jobs in France, which means jobs. As a politician, you don't want to lose votes. So you create jobs outside in those places. And how do you create jobs in those places? You talk to the right person, make his pocket happy, then you get the contracts. The jobs are there. When you check it, what is it? National? So the others cheated the Tanzanians here with the security issues. And when they were asked, they said what? National security. So you should be careful of all these things. Somebody will be asked, why is that person doing that? Because he loves Africa. Why? So when it is convenient, they do it. It is not convenient, they run away from it. That's the way we should see it. So it is in the interest of the Chinese to get ahead by being respectful to the host country. That's all. I think I've answered you there.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Okay, now we are coming to the end of the very important exercise, and this is how we're doing the launch. First, I'm going to give the main highlights of our press statement, and then thereafter I will call my colleagues to come up front and Captain from FNF as well with your colleagues, and we'll all get copies of this. So the launch, we haven't bought any balloons, no. We'll simply carry it up high for the photographers to be able to capture the launch. And so I'm just going to give the key highlights and also try to put it in the Kenyan context. So we are launching today a very important report that follows a study that we did as Interregion Economic Network, supported by the Frederick Ammon Foundation last year between October to December 16th. After analyzing perceptions of over 1,000 thought leaders from Africa, we have a report today entitled The Clash of Systems, which captures the African perceptions of the European Union and China engagement. What we did today, of course, was to get some Kenyan thought leaders, Professor Munene and Ali Khan Sachu, to give their comments on our report, and we shall be sharing this with the media shortly. The main highlights that come out of this report are as follows. The report has established that China has a competitive advantage in 4 areas of its success in Africa. And the 4 areas are as follows. The Chinese are quick in making decisions. They are faster in implementing projects, and they actively respect the non-interference in internal affairs policy, and they are soft on matters of corruption. Here, what I mean is the Chinese do not give up on deploying corruption as a tool to meet their interests. And then the second aspect of the highlight is that while Africa and African leaders largely appreciate European value-based policies, they perceive the Europeans to be largely paternalistic, meaning they do not respect the Africans or they treat Africa as children. The third highlight is that if Europe has to up its game in this competition with China in Africa, Europe must shift the focus of its engagement from Africa from aid to trade and recognize Africa as a strategic partner and engage the African continent as a continent of opportunity. And then for the African policymakers, the key highlight here is, and this is important for us, especially in Kenya now that we are having elections and we know all political parties are looking inward, that Africans must leverage the interest of the two powers. Here we assume European Union as well, but as we all know, European Union, of course, is a union of around 27 countries, while China is one bloc. So the point here being that African policymakers, Africans in general, and even our politicians have to be aware that because we have two powers competing in Africa, there's now what would largely refer to as the competition of narratives. You could use the word propaganda, but we chose not to use the word propaganda. I think it's about narratives. So far, the European Union, when it comes to narratives, I think they have got an upper hand. But the Chinese decided not to go into the narrative competition. They decided to go into what Dr. Adero was referring to as hardware, meaning let the road speak for itself. And I think in Kenya we can see the debate, even in politics, we can talk about democracy, but something to do with the expressway will always show up, or standard gauge railway line will always show up. So it means the railway line talks on behalf of the Chinese somehow. So those are the key highlights. So I'm not going to read the entire press statement. I think this I'll let Juma distribute to all the press members present. And I think the message for Kenya, because now we have elections, is that we should be cautious not to be too much inward looking, even as we approach the last mile, because we need to also query our candidates about the plans they have to navigate the competing powers. Because if we fail to have proper navigation tools, then it means that whoever takes over the leadership is going to have a rough time, trying to manage the interests of China, the interests of the European Union, or generally what we call the interests of the West. And we've seen it playing out already in terms of the war in Ukraine. If we put it in the context, you've seen countries being reminded not to import goods from certain countries and maybe not to be friendly to other countries. So that's why we need leaders who can navigate these kinds of pressures. Otherwise, without having the proper know-how, it can easily lead to a scenario where the clash of systems will drown Kenya's interests, as Professor pointed out. So at this juncture, I'd like to invite Kepta, Juma, and National Dero, and to come and of course we launch the report with no balloons, no fireworks. Can we get copies? And Kepta can come with one of the ethnic members as well to join it. Yeah, yes. And then I think if there are enough questions, we will everybody. And then thereafter we'll invite educations to the research team, and we can respond to the questions. Then we conclude with the event. Looks like the books are still in the ocean. Come on. Okay, super, we have them. So I think we could, without stepping on any gadgets, we can, yeah. Yeah, I think if we move this way so that at least we can also capture the supporting organization. Okay, I do have mine, thanks. So ladies and gentlemen, the report we are launching today, we have a summary of this, and as Dr. pointed out, the online version is also available, because I know nowadays many people prefer to simply download, right? Is it called download or upload? So the soft version is available, and the hard copy is also available. And as you can see, this is a clash of systems, African perceptions of the European Union and China engagement. Please underline the word perception, because as Professor pointed out, there's a recent study when it comes to debt trap, which shows actually Africa is more indebted to the West than to China, and that's not a perception. But you see, perception shows Africa is more indebted to China. You see, so it's important to underline that term, perception. Okay? So we can smile. Asante. I think we've captured enough response.
Yeah, look at the camera.
Okay, we look at one.
One.
Can we open it as well? No, you don't want it to open, right?
You can just discuss this.
Yeah.
Discuss with the
Sometimes that's told
Center.
to us. If we can probably, yeah. Remember there used to be the English grammar school, colleague my friend. Yeah. Finally, it's done, right? I don't know. Thanks. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
So the rest of the discussion can continue.
Yeah.
Let me just make one observation, one other, just in an addendum. Since the publication of this report, I've taken a great deal of interest in China, and so I track news on China. Yesterday, I saw a report which was very interesting, and this is not Africa, it's India. India was doing a comparative analysis as to why it's lagging behind China, and they found something very interesting. At their ports, it takes 20 stages spread over a number of weeks to clear a ship. In China, the same process takes only 5 steps and only a couple of days. So competitiveness in Africa in terms of business, the cost of doing business and the efficiency, I think it should be a subject of discussion.
Yeah, I remember the purpose of this is to catalyze more research, catalyze more intellectual conversation on this topic. And again, as Professor Ali Khan pointed out, is to caution us not to be too much inward looking. It's important to say all politics. For example, if I want to be governor of Nairobi, I have to learn how to box the wall, then I win, right? If I want to be governor of Kakamega, I have to learn how to slaughter chicken, then I win. All politics is wrong. But when it comes to the reality of uplifting your country to the next level, it can never be local. A leader has to go beyond being local. And that's part of what Professor Mena was highlighting, that it's important that our leaders pay attention, and even their team that advises them pay attention to these realities that are not necessarily local. You can win, but if you miss the game, then you're in for a tough ride, similar to what we've seen in Sri Lanka, for example. So I give the press an opportunity to ask questions. If they don't have questions, then we simply provide them with a press release, and we cross fingers that you will cover our report. Do you have anybody with a question from the press? Comment, observation? Or we gave you too much? I think we were very strategic. We planned to bring in great thinkers, Alika Sachu, great thinker, Professor Munene, and of course the team that did the research. This is to thank you very much, Dr. National Bureau, Josephat Juma, Captain Beta, he played a key role by the way in the editing, because remember there's one thing to get a report, but to edit it, to get it to the precise comment. This is part of the work Stephen and the Captain did in editing the report. So if we don't have questions, mine will be to say thank you. Please join us in having a cup of coffee, and we wish you all the best as we approach our 20th day, which is 9 August, right? May we vote wisely. Asante sana.